You better be listening to Sleazoids or I must break you.
Sex, that's where I come in. Dead or alive, sex is always in need of my services. A service to which I sincerely apply myself wholeheartedly. Sometimes even in the daylight hours.
You're stupid minds! Stupid! Stupid! That's all I'm taking from you. Get back here!
Show me a person, man or woman, who can say sex doesn't enter their minds more than they care to admit, and I'll show you a dead human.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Sleazoids, the podcast where we go down the rabbit hole of 20th century genre fare, from the most influential canon classics to the trashiest exploitation films we can get our hands on, and invite you to tag along in helping us create a canon of sleaze. Each week is a double feature grindhouse style where we discuss two films loosely related by subject, genre, actor, filmmaker, or franchise, and at the end of each episode, along with our honorary Sleazoids, which you can become by subscribing on Patreon.
Grab your shanks, folks. Next week, we are going to prison. Join that sleaze.
We decide on all the official ratings or rankings for every film that we cover. Patreon subscribers also get an on-air shout-out and 2 bonus episodes every single month, which we have been doing for over 6 years or something like that now.
Yeah, 5 or 6,
yeah, so there's like 140 something bonus episodes, as well as our bonus transmission series where we talk about new release genre films. So we definitely recommend making the jump if that interests you. Patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast. And speaking of which, we did have quite a few people make the jump this week, so we'll give them their shout outs here. We had Spike Spiegel, we had The Brando, we had Ryan Paulson, we had Johnny Brindato, we had CE, we had Casey Campbell, Dustin Cooner, Sloppy K, Vigilante, Thumb, Robbie Wilston, Wombat, Mattia Ivanovic, Just Jay, Jill Morrison, and last but not least, we had Jordan Myers, who actually signed up for an entire year of the show, which, as a reminder, you can sign up. You can get an entire year of the show for a little bit of a discounted monthly rate if you're interested. So thanks to Jordan for doing that. That is the one plug for the week. The other plug, as always, is Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you were listening on either one of those platforms, and I can see the stats, I can see you right now listening on both of those platforms. Give us a good old rating and review over there. It helps us climb the ranks and find new listeners. We appreciate that support as well. And the very last plug, as always, is merch. If you like the poster art that based out of Toronto horror artist Trevor Henderson did for the show, you can get that put on basically anything that you can think of. And you freaks have thought of a lot of things. You can get just a shirt or a hoodie. You can get, I think people have bought pens and pillows and notebooks. You can find the link to that in the description, as well as over at sleazoidspodcast.com for anyone who's interested. But that is it for the intro. Welcome back to another week. As always, I am your host, Josh Lewis, and joining me also, as always, is my co-host,
Jamie Miller. Welcome back, everybody.
Welcome. I think 2 weeks ago would have been the last time you folks over on the main feed would have heard from us, and we would have had first-time guest on Brendan Ross, the programmer of the Neon Dreams Cinema Club repertory series here in Toronto, who plays all kinds of 70s and 80s neon noir, very stylish crime films, and as a result, you can imagine what we talked about on his episode. We did some very stylish, autobiographical, and kind of emotionally fragile 80s Los Angeles films with a double feature of James Bridges's very haunting and mournful neo-noir called Mike's Murder from 1984, which was starring Deborah Winger and was their follow-up to Urban Cowboy. And it was just this really depressing sort of like drug dealing in LA film that was based on the real-life murder of a friend of his.
Yeah, and we've said it in the last week too, but it's got this doomed feeling to it because it's called Mike's Murder, and that's essentially what you're waiting for. And it actually takes a little while. They sink you into it and really get to know the characters before all of the tragedy happens. So it's great. And Deborah Winger is awesome. She's become someone I want to check out a little more.
Yeah, and then his Brendan's pairing with that was a very underseen, kind of tender, sexy buddy rom-com film called Heartbreakers from 1984, which doesn't sound like immediately the vibe to coincide with that, but it actually same place, same kind of grubby location shooting as Los Angeles, and definitely does have like a more sort of darker emotional quality to it that kind of bubbles up alongside the hangout aspect, and also just fun to see Peter Coyote as like an S&M bondage fetish painter.
Yeah, it's really good stuff, and it's amazing too. It's like this sex comedy that just turns into a really sad bromance. So yeah,
exactly.
I liked it.
Yeah, so we had a good time breaking those down with Brendan last week, and both films were pretty underseen. So I definitely recommend going back and maybe checking those films out as well. But last week over on the Patreon feed, we did a bit of a left turn out of that episode, and we went and did our first episode on the legendarily proclaimed worst filmmaker of all time. We talked about one Edward D. Wood Jr., and we talked about his debut autobiographical cross-dressing documentary psychodrama called Glenn or Glenda from 1953 that we broke down. We actually talked a lot longer about it than I expected, because it basically functions as a bizarre and sort of dated educational PSA about cross-dressing, and but is also progressive for the time, and also a confessional, like personal essay of a guy just who clearly wants to be seen and understood for who he really is, and has Ed Wood actually basically playing himself anxious and terrified and coming out of the closet to his girlfriend, played by his real life girlfriend Dolores Fuller, and it was kind of an insane thing to witness for the first time, as well as his notorious worst movie of all time, deemed science fiction horror film Plan 9 from Outer Space, where he took his obvious passion for a dead type of old-timey Hollywood movie that he grew up on, and basically just, in our opinion, kind of tried his best to reanimate it with every meager, no-budget Halloween store trick that he, knew how to do in this kind of endearing way, even when the movie didn't totally work for us.
Yeah, specifically the cemetery set is a lot of fun. Just a lot of just jagged-looking branches, cobwebs, fog machine. This kind of, I don't know, I can't remember what you call them, but I guess it's like a tomb, but it looks like it's made out of cardboard. It's very fun. It's good stuff.
A giant Swedish wrestler as a zombie just walking
just
around
smacking
in it.
people and knocking them out. Yeah, it's a good time.
It's wonderful. Ed Wood movies have a wonderful vibe to them, and I think we tried to, go a little bit to bat for them instead of, trying to do the boring bad movie podcast episode. So if you haven't heard that was over on the Patreon feed last week, and it was strategically placed, I'll say, because moving on to this week, we have a very special returning guest joining us. I believe this is his third time talking with us. He is the host, obviously, of some podcasts I'm sure people have heard of, the Important Cinema Club and the Michael and Us podcast, and that guest is Toronto's own Will Sloan. Will, we're very glad to have you on this week specifically because, when I was being like, I want to have Will back on. Normally we have the guests just free reign, choose whatever you want. But I did kind of lead you on a little bit with this one because I was like, somehow we haven't talked about Ed Wood. And I was scrolling through all of the writing I could find on Ed Wood, and Mr. Will Sloan's name popped up every single time I happened to research. I even tried to do research on this week's movies, and I was like, if you Googled these movies, your previous articles came up on them. So I was like, okay, well, Will is the guy for this because he is what do you call it? Is it a woodology? It is you are a scholar of Ed Wood.
I'm not even the world's greatest woodologist. I mean, there are some true freaks out there who really know everything, and shout out to those guys. But I'm glad to hear that my stuff comes up when you Google these movies. What a legacy that is.
Exactly. But Will, as it goes, we do have the guests bring the films with you. So which two, when I said we wanted to talk about Ed Wood and I wanted some deep cuts, you selected these for us. So which two Ed Wood films have you brought with you to talk about this week, and why did you pair them together?
Well, the first one that came to mind was Take It Out in Trade, which is the last movie he made that, kind of has its foot in the mainstream still. Which, has a toe in the mainstream. It's his last movie that isn't like hardcore porno. And I chose this one, frankly, because I think it's like, for want of a better word, kind of good, or like at the very least, it complicates our understanding, or the popular understanding of Ed Wood as a quote unquote bad filmmaker. I think it's doing a lot of like really interesting things. I think it's very much a product of the man who made Glen or Glenda, but it also just shows like different sides of him, shows different things he was capable of, and vexes anyone who wants to put him in that golden turkey box. And then for the other one, I could have picked Jailbait. I could have picked one of the easier ones, but there's something about The Only House in Town, which he made shortly after Take It Out in Trade, made is maybe not the right word for what he did to this. It's like no other movie I've ever seen. It's accidentally very dreamlike, which is a quality I like in a lot of Ed Wood's movies, but in this one takes it to an extreme. It's maybe the most threadbare thing he ever made, and it's taken up residency in my brain. I find it just a mysterious and endlessly strange place to be in. So I think I maybe want to work through some of my feelings about it. Oh, and also, The Only House in Town is a movie that I think maybe you need to have been hit in the head a lot of times to really enjoy. Like it's for the true sickos. And I think I kind of want to talk about that too. I also just wanted to like inflict it on you guys and see what would happen. Like, what would you...
No, we're very stoked. You are still one of the only people who has ever brought full-on pornography films with you on the podcast. We've kind of made our way sideways into a couple of them, talking about Hisayasu Sato, for example, a little bit of Doris Wishman, so we've definitely had flexed a little bit, but no one has straight up brought a sexploitation softcore pornography double feature, and especially not that of Made by Ed Wood. Probably, most people will know him for Plan 9 from Outer Space, and maybe you won't even know that he spent his 70s starting with softcore pornography, eventually moving his way into hardcore pornography right before his death.
I'm not bringing these movies here just out of kind of like sheer like contrarian perversity either. Like, I think if you take Ed Wood seriously as an artist, and I do, I think the movies that he made, from 1970 to 1973, or that small little burst of erotic films that he made, they do carry on a lot of the themes and ideas that were circulating in his classic movies, as well as the multitude of novels that he was writing around this time. Right. They do feel like a logical extension or maybe end point of stuff that was percolating in those earlier movies. I find that interesting. I think there can be a temptation to just want to put these movies aside, but I think if you really like Ed Wood, these movies are a rich terrain.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. And I'm excited to, we did Ed Wood of the 1950s last week, and I'm excited to take a look more at including his debut, and now we're going to talk maybe a little bit closer to the end of his career. We're going to get kind of a little bit of a full portrait of the man. So that being said, I'm excited to jump right into it. Let's start things off here. Let's talk about Take It Out in Trade.
About this kind of carrying on.
Another guy from McGregor, Mom. He says everything here is all wet.
I'll get even. You mark my word, I'll get even with it. Vulgar.
All right, we are talking Take It Out in Trade, the 1970 American softcore sexploitation noir parody written and directed by Ed Wood. And as I mentioned, we did a big deep dive episode on Ed Wood and Glen or Glenda and Plan 9 last week over on the Patreon. So if you haven't heard that episode, I would recommend going back to it for a little bit of context for this, although I am glad that we have Will to also fill us in on any details that we that we flubbed as we go along here. But for the short version, we went into Ed Wood's kind of origins as a young boy in love with sort of like pulp horror and westerns and noirs and science fiction, who, you know, loved performing in school plays and bands, and graduated and moved directly from New York to LA with his scrapbook of Hollywood stars that he stole images and stills from magazines. And he traveled in his Angora sweater and brown skirt combo that his mom dressed him up in, that, you know, began his sort of gender nonconformity and sort of fetishes that he had, and his alter ego Shirley, who we'll talk about a little bit, who the name Shirley makes an appearance in this. And we did also talk about his time living in crummy apartments and dodging collection agencies and trying to get movies made with various sleazy producers, as well as, obviously, for anyone who's seen the Tim Burton biopic about him, his relationship with the late depressed and morphine-addicted Dracula star Bela Lugosi, whom he befriended and recruited into shooting a few minutes of footage for him on many of his early films so that he could put Bela's name on the poster and get various Hollywood actors that he liked as a kid involved, people like Lyle Talbot, people like Vampira, who was in Plan 9, and get them interested in making his kind of no-budget genre films. And I kind of wanted to begin there because despite the fact that this is very much a softcore porno film and it has all of the things that you imagine right away when you hear that, this is also very much an Ed Wood film in terms of his vision of LA, the kinds of people who populate his version of LA that he knows and loves. The comedy. And the humor especially. And so I was quite shocked the first time that I kind of actually sat down and watched this, and I was like, you know, it doesn't quite have his use of Bela Lugosi, which definitely for him kind of symbolized almost like a Sunset Boulevard style, like death of Hollywood that he loved. And he was someone who I really loved, that he still shot and treated Bela like a movie star, even in his old age there, when everyone else had kind of completely forgotten him. And it's interesting that this kind of just has a sort of similar version of LA in it that I really liked.
Jay Hoberman wrote a bit of phraseology that I liked. He said, Ed Wood was a toadstool at the edge of Hollywood, nourished by the movie industry's compost. And I think
that's so vivid.
yeah, it's really good. And I think that those classic 50s movies are sort of like if the institution of the Hollywood movie went to sleep and had a dream about itself. So, you know, as you mentioned, he uses these faded stars from when he was a child, like Bela Lugosi, Lyle Talbot, Tom Keane, a bunch of cowboy actors. And then there are these people, and then you've got LA novelty celebrities like Criswell and Vampira and Tor Johnson, or Bunny Breckenridge, you know, weirdos who were kind of eccentrics in the Los Angeles scene.
Yeah, when I heard that he was a carnival guy for a while, I feel like Ed Wood's movies kind of opened up for me a lot, and especially the kind of faces and personalities that he'd like to populate his movies with.
Totally. And then on top of that, you've got people from his own entourage, like wannabes, you know, his friends and hangers-on, people who didn't have any sort of career outside of his movies. And you've got all these people who are sharing the frame, and they shouldn't be sharing the frame. And they're enacting these very low-budget facsimiles of the sorts of movies Ed Wood watched as a child. Like Bride of the Monster is a Bela Lugosi fan film. His Western pilot, Crossroads Avenger, is a Western fan film. And so they're like these Hollywood dreamscapes. And when you get to the adult films, it's kind of like the last third of Mulholland Drive, you know, when the sleeper is beginning to wake up. Like this, you know, those early films are like the dream of Hollywood, or unpleasant or not an unpleasant, a tumbling dream of Hollywood. And then you're waking up and you're seeing the world that Ed Wood actually lived in, but you're still sort of half asleep. And I think you see that in Take It Out in Trade, which I think just like as an LA movie is incredibly evocative. And as an Ed Wood movie is also very evocative.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was stoked turning this one on because Jamie and I, obviously, we just started exploring Ed Wood for the first time last week, and I had seen a lot of clips and I had seen the Tim Burton movie. I kind of knew a little bit of what to expect going in, and I just hadn't really jumped in yet. And we knew he was this fascinating figure in low budget exploitation filmmaking. We knew we'd have to talk about him at some point, and we also knew that he was famous for having, such obvious technical limitations and maybe very little control and skill with filmmaking in like the typical sense of how people would use those words. And, he made movies on whatever money he could scramble from investors, including, like hustling the Baptist church for funding on Plan 9, for example, is something that he did. And it resulted in many of his friends and coworkers basically either calling him this like lovable, passionate dude with a dream, or he was a self-destructive con man. And we kind of ended up liking his movies last week because the truth was that he was kind of something in the middle of those two things. And it really showed in his art. And despite how much people want to make fun of him for the Poverty Row cheapness of his films, the jump cuts, the strange incorporation of stock footage, the chintzy looking sets, the no budget special effects, or completely bizarre and unnatural dialogue at times that even the actors were like, yeah, we were kind of rewriting because we literally couldn't get our throats to say them the way that he had written them. And there was just a certain amount of like childish do-it-yourself enthusiasm and occasionally accidentally surreal and dreamy beauty, which is something I'd never imagined myself saying about his movies because I had seen Will kind of suggest that. And I was like, is that true? And I was like, it kind of is true. And there's a real beating heart behind it. For example, the big sequence in Glen or Glenda, which to me kind of defined the rest of his career, and you do see, make its way through the rest of it, is Bela Lugosi ranting about the Green Dragon over top of Ed Wood's real life fears of coming out of the closet to his girlfriend. Like it works as surreal nightmare horror. It works as sort of, personal statement. And, I was moved watching the sequence of everyone laughing at him and like surrounding him like Romero zombies, which is something, that he was, sadly not really proven wrong about in his real life. He did not get the fantasy cure happy ending that is maybe a little problematic to look at today. And he ended up kind of broken up with and becoming an alcoholic and eventually dying in poverty, and in order to make money having to write pornographic novels and make sexploitation films with like we're going to be talking about today. So I don't know, there was just I was very primed queuing this up to have some more affection for Ed Wood than I expected, and then being like, well, this is, he made this for the little bit of money that he could at the time so that he could buy the liquor that he wanted from the local store. But I was just, I was a little surprised to see that this was actually more of a personal outing than I expected going into it.
Yeah, like even the very beginning with the narrator, he kind of has that contrast of what he looks at as LA, where he's like, this is his kind of town. It's big, it's mighty, it's powerful. But then right after that, he's like, there's smog, there's fog, there's drugs. Like it's just,
it's a real mess, but I love it,
Yeah, and even as he's doing that, he's editing together these images of like, first there's like the skyscrapers in the city and kind of the busy life of that, and then it goes to more of like the suburbs where people are poorer and the houses look a little bit more run down, and then he goes back to the city. It's kind of this back and forth thing that he does, and it is a little bit jarring the way he edits this film in particular. All of his films have weird edits, of course, but this one I found. Either he was making a cool point with the contrasts that he was trying to go with, or the jump cuts really worked with comedy a lot in this, I found. Like a lot of the time they'll do something where we'll get to the actual plot, but like with the detective where they'll set something up for him and be like, hey, I wonder what he's up to. Jump to him doing some pervert thing, and it's kind of like over the top and ridiculous. And I don't know, I always got a kick out of that. I thought it was kind of, it really worked on a comedic level, and it seemed slightly more on purpose than some of the stuff that he's done in the past that still ends up working.
Oh yeah, totally. Like when I saw this, when I saw this for the first time, it felt like kind of a missing piece of the Ed Wood puzzle. When we talk about him as a technically incompetent filmmaker or as an untalented filmmaker, I mean, you look at Plan 9 from Outer Space, and yeah, he's not Edgar G. Ulmer. He doesn't know how to use his limitations in a movie like that. But on the other hand, that cemetery set is sort of like, it has an accidental power to it. Because the movie forces you to just sit on this 6 square feet of soundstage and does not let you out of it until you sort of have to pretend that you're in this zone of perpetual night. It sort of pulls off this accidental trick. But while and I think Take It Out in Trade, there are a million moments where he doesn't know how to match a shot, where he doesn't know how to compose an image, where he doesn't know how to create an arresting composition. There are a million moments like that. But then in all of these movies, there are just really weird visual ideas, really strange instincts, to say nothing of the ideas of the films, the themes, just on a technical level. It's crazy the stuff he attempts in Glen or Glenda. And it's, all the dream sequence stuff, the integration of fantasy and reality in that film, and multiple layers of narration. And in this movie, the truly insane Mobius strip editing style, and
it is ridiculous, yeah.
And what he's doing with color, it's I don't know what the strategy is. You can say it's a little tasteless, but my God, he's just going for this it's
certainly something, right? In a world where there's and we said this last week, but where there's so many technically competent films that just suck and feel generated by AI even before they might actually be. I can't help but look at something so just totally unique in the world of this true outsider artist and not find something intriguing about it. And I think we mentioned it was, I think, Dave Kerr's review last week, because he was kind of a fan of Ed Wood, and he called him an unconscious avant-gardist, where his movies may be filled with blunders, but they are unusually creative and oddly expressive. And I think that it was just totally accurate, and it made its way into, movies that you could imagine someone else making, and this would be so much more boring. Because we've covered a decent amount of sort of sexploitation and kind of nudie cutie films, and I don't think I've ever seen one as strange as trying to also be a love letter to noirs, that he really loves them, because we'll get into the basic premise here, but it stars Michael Donovan O'Donnell as Detective Mac McGregor, this gap-toothed, mustached, gumshoe private eye doing maniacal voiceover. Sex is always in need of my services, sometimes even in the daylight. And this is one of my case files. And, he has a cardboard sign in a bathroom for his phone number in his office. And the story is one of him. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, that moment when he had the cardboard sign just done in marker, I was because of the kind of, I guess, preconception that Ed Wood has, I was curious if they were that's all they could muster on set that day. And so I had this kind of layer of already thinking that was funny to me. And then when it revealed that he was actually making the joke and he was in the bathroom and he fully, that was the joke itself, I just thought I think it was something that only we could probably experience, or at least I could experience if you guys didn't, where you have this preconception of maybe some of his faults in his filmmaking. And so it's almost you think that's the joke, but then he actually reveals that he wrote that in the story itself.
Totally.
I don't know if you had that same idea.
No, I did. Yeah, where I was
I saw that, I was
that's all he could afford, and then it's no,
he's a sign. Yeah, exactly.
No, 100%.
So I thought that was funny.
That, to me, that's why this movie is kind of the missing piece of the Ed Wood puzzle, because the movie is constantly making its own cheapness part of the joke. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but part of the plot is that this detective is constantly going on these unnecessary like foreign trips. And Ed Wood will show you like he's gone to LAX and just shot footage of planes taking off, and then he'll cut to like somebody like, you know, dressed in a beret in front of a poster that says France. And like that's the joke. The joke is, of course, we didn't shoot there. This is
I laughed every time.
Yeah. And to see Ed Wood like
and it is funny
have fun
too.
with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is funny to watch, like, because the way he sets up the French guy, he's just like a very stereotypical cliche French dude. He's just got like the beret. He's drunk walking in front of the sign, and it's just a poster with like in a black set. Like he doesn't even try to make it look like there's a like some type of wall put up that would be in an airport or anything like that. So it is very funny. Or even when he does the later gag with the same French guy, I think, where he's like wasted at the restaurant. And I think his girlfriend ends up getting mad at him, so she goes over to the detective, which is in the same set, which is very funny. They just cut to the same table that the Frenchman was just at, but now it's the detective.
In front of the same curtain, and the detective is smoking in front of a no smoking sign
that says France. Yeah, it's, oh my God, it's so funny.
I also think it's interesting that the detective has his office in the bathroom of the Brown Derby, which, I mean, in the movie Ed Wood, as well as in real life, the Brown Derby was this, you know, iconic Hollywood eatery where Ed Wood would often try to raise money for his movies. He'd have lunches for investors, and you know, to him, this kid from the East Coast who came west, like the Brown Derby was symbolic of Hollywood glamour, and he liked to, you know, spend as much time and money there as he could. And I sort of like that the movie announces itself in those early scenes as this is a gutter production. You know, we are in the bathroom of the Brown Derby. We are at the fence outside LAX.
Yeah, well, and I liked your point about how unnecessary the travelogue aspect is of the film too, because he very well could just make the movie. He goes brothel to brothel in LA.
Really.
Yeah.
Like it's just that there's no reason he needs to be traveling further, or that the girl would have even traveled further, because to maybe get to the basic story is that the detective is investigating a sort of like missing runaway daughter of a sort of like straight-laced wealthy couple, and the daughter is named Shirley, the alter ego of Ed Wood when he was in drag. And they fear that Shirley is, who knows what she's up to. She's maybe living a liberated, perhaps criminal sex worker lifestyle of some kind. And so Mac McGregor is to the rescue to find out what's going to happen. But of course, he uses it as an excuse to just go on the father's dime and travel around and go to all the various brothels and just kind of indulge himself. And that's definitely the most overtly comedic stuff, is just the detective antics. Him going on the case and just being girls, I really love girls, you know, and just a montage of him voyeuristically spying on or hiring prostitutes, and just all of the shots of him like mugging and like licking his lips and his eyes bulging like a cartoon wolf, watching all of the various sex core scenes, hiding behind bushes and dumpsters. And at one point he just pulls out
binoculars and shit,
that giant bottle of scotch that he just pulls out. That's like a giant like fake Czech style bottle of scotch. He's just a totally goofy character that, you know, the movie has a sense of humor about, but also does kind of have a little bit of, you know, kind of like a satirical progressive critique of a little bit, where Ed Wood is being like, you know, like this guy, you know, is, you know, a sort of cartoonishly awful depiction of what the quote unquote like male gaze might be in this case, which is, you know, for 1970 softcore porno, a little bit more progressive than your average one, I'd say.
Well,
and then I think it's funny too, though, just to have like the difference is there's also scenes where they'll just be talking about like him, you know, working on the case, and they'll just splice in boobs and people dry humping ferociously, which would be the way to say it, ferociously. These people, when they're dry humping in some of these scenes, I'm like, this does not look like pleasurable sex whatsoever. It's very funny, honestly. But one of my favorite, just as a comedic moment, was when Mr. Riley, who's the guy that hires the PI to find Shirley, he says something like, it cuts to them and he's just like, I wonder what the detective's up to now, like what clues that he's discovered. And it just cuts to the detective right away with a boob just in his mouth full. And you just watch it for like 30 seconds. And it's just the hard cut to it is, in my opinion, absolutely hilarious. So, and
I believe the line that sets it up is, he says he's on a hot tip. And then it cuts to him.
That's the one, right? Oh my God, it's juvenile, but it's so funny. It's just the hard cut makes it so good.
But yeah, as to the film's sort of treatment of, gender and masculinity, I mean, Ed Wood is a pretty complicated guy, obviously. I mean, by all accounts, in his personal life, he had heterosexual appetites, and he would often present himself as a sort of very masculine guy, but then he also had this other persona. He liked to go out in drag. He called himself Shirley. Who knows how he might have identified now, if indeed he would have identified as he, if the idea of being gender fluid might not have fully been available to him at the time. Mm-hmm. But in a lot of particularly his novels, but also some of these later movies, and Glen or Glenda, of course, you can see this fascination with masculine, men being overpowered. He's interested in he's interested in masculinity and femininity as these roles that can be played, and the sort of reversal of power of when somebody who's hyper masculine is dommed by women. You can see that in a movie that he was in called The Love Feast. That is very much about that. And he sees the gender binary as a sort of site of dominance and humiliation often. I don't want to bring the conversation too down, but he wrote a novel called The Only House in Town that I've read that is not actually related to the movie of the same name. That includes, I read it a year or two ago, and I was quite shocked because it's quite unpleasant. It's got a lot of sexual violence in it. And there's this one scene involving the assault of a transgender sex worker. Very different tonally from this movie, where it's this was definitely a site where you're working through some stuff. And I guess that's all I can say about it. But yeah, this was clearly a very vulnerable spot for him. And when we see Mac McGregor later in this movie, you see all the women dominate him on the bed. It's in that part of Ed Wood's brain.
Yeah, well, and Ed Wood obviously also appears in the film as a character named Alicia, as a drag queen character, and it is a little bit of a different, there's been an interesting development since the kind of closeted shame of Glen or Glenda a little bit, where, he's totally just confidently playing a drag queen character in this. He's got the bright green dress and sort of the bombshell blonde wig that he always wanted, and he's sitting cross-legged on the garish couch that he's on, clearly trying to act his ass off and talk about his relationship with Shirley up against Mac McGregor. And in all of these scenes with the various drag queens or sex workers or any kind of character that Ed Wood clearly probably knew in his real life and does have some kind of, sympathy for. The gumshoe private eye is just beating the absolute shit out of them. And it's, and he's doing it in a way that he thinks he's being, kind of funny. But it every single time it happened, it did actually create a little bit of a, an interesting contradictory effect where you're having a lot of fun watching this guy make the, the big bulging eyes looking at, all the various breasts that just appear randomly on the screen sometimes, and he's doing some funny antics, and then you'll get that moment when that huge smash zoom on him just ripping Ed Wood's wig off and just seeing Ed Wood's shocked, hurt face.
Yeah.
That it just like kind of holds on in that moment. And, you know, it does sort of complicate this in an interesting way that I did kind of find effective and a little bit more subversive because, you know, again, this is something that is very specific and personal to Ed Wood. It's something that is totally in line with his stylistic quirks and his sort of thematic interests. And it did sort of turn the movie into more of like an intentional satire of the two genres that we've been talking about in a kind of way that is, you know, not completely different than something John Waters might do or something Doris Wishman might do. And, you know, and it really does spice up an otherwise kind of occasionally dull softcore porn film with all of his obsessions, because you have the old Hollywood genre movie aspect with all of the noir stuff. You have his own sort of like dingy LA, you know, personality and humor that he has. And as we've been talking about, the sort of vaguely sort of like sexually progressive, you know, view of some of these characters. And yeah, so I don't know. I found that aspect really interesting and sort of did clarify a little bit for me, the sort of breakdown editing of it. Like, who knows, maybe he was just making random choices. Maybe he was like, you know, some of these characters are sort of hippie-ish, so maybe it'll give it a psychedelic rapid cut kind of strangeness to it or something. But like, you know, it is funny at a certain point how often just a random part of the movie will just appear in the middle of like another scene, and it'll just repeat certain shots. Like how many times do we go back to that woman on the couch doing like the praying hands with her breasts out? I actually lost track. I tried keeping track early on and I was like, I don't remember how many times we did this.
Yeah.
He also does these interesting things. He does it a few times in this movie actually, and he did it in, it might have been even both Plan 9 and Glen or Glenda, where he splices in those like thunder lightning strikes that you would see in, you know, Dracula or Frankenstein or something like that.
I love those. Those are a warm bath to me.
Yeah.
But in a way,
yeah,
that
totally.
shot you mentioned of the woman on the couch like fills that function of the thunder and lightning. You know, it's this thing that he cuts to like, when he doesn't know what else to cut to.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is funny. He like in this he does it in the violent moments where it's like the lightning strikes, and then in the moments where it's almost like he thinks that whatever he's showing you in the plotting is a little bit dull, so he just splices in like boobs and dry humping again.
Yeah.
And he does both, and it's both of them.
Which is funny though, because I don't know about you guys. Did you guys not find that the actual softcore elements were maybe like the more dull? I thought everything around them was like a little bit more lively and kind of had his personality to him. Even the scenes of the girls lounging, like the house decor was bizarre, and I kind of liked hanging out in the weird like, you know, the gold skull next to the rotary phone, the giant fuzzy red carpeted staircase, and all of the like weird, the bearded guy who shows up and goes, speaking of, Will mentioned Mulholland Drive, the guy who's like, this must be the place. I was like, that he almost delivers it in like that weird, this is the girl voice from Mulholland Drive. Yeah. And I don't know, I thought that like, strangely enough, the actual pornography, and you know, this is one we'll join a line of episodes where we have actually judged the pornographic skills of filmmakers who have put it into their films, including Andy Milligan, who did it on Seeds, Doris Wishman, obviously on Bad Girls Go to Hell, and Hisayasu Sato on Celluloid Nightmare. You know, we have judged their porno chops, and I would put Ed Wood kind of on maybe the lower end of those filmmakers, but maybe I'm also judging him based on the diversity of his personal fetishes that we know. I kind of expected them to make their way more into the sex scenes of the film, but a lot of them are pretty just standard, and maybe it's out of obligation to the market, but it's a lot of just like topless walking around, occasionally like a butt cheek is grabbed, you know, it's not particularly inventive. You know, there's a brief shot of like a mechanical horse ride.
Every single one, I think, in this, like, is mostly just comedic, it seems. And it's hard to say. Half of them seem on purposely comedic, the way that he directs them. I mean, you have the PI doing the, like, Looney Tunes dog thing and all of that. And then even, like I was mentioning before, the dry humping itself is very strange looking. Like, it doesn't seem, like, natural. It feels performative in a weird way itself, and so I found like every single sexual scene in this to be, you know, it's softcore porn, but for me it was almost just comedy, like the whole time. it is weird because it's not like if you're just judging it on like what was that one that we watched? Maybe it was you, Will, that brought it on, the horror porno.
Oh,
Widow Blue.
Widow Blue.
Years ago.
Yeah.
Widow Blue, yeah. Like there's just, I mean, we have dick slicings and like whatever else in that. I mean, granted, that's not what Ed Wood is really going for here, but yeah, most of his sexual stuff is comedic in this, and I found that to be interesting. And also, I got to say, because we were talking about how there's like two scenes that really take more of a serious tone, and that's the scene with Ed Wood, at least by like the second half of it, and then the scene before it too with oddly enough a character named Sleazy Maisie Rumpeldink, and she's
played by
like
Nona
a
Carver,
drug addict, a hooker. Yes. And, when he walks in and just barges in, really, he's immediately like telling them what to do. He kicks the client out. He's threatening to take her drugs away. She's saying like that she's poor and she doesn't have any other, hits to take. And,
yeah, it's just really sad,
like,
actually.
It's actually a lot more serious and sad than the rest of the film. It's probably the only scene that didn't make me kind of chuckle in some way.
You didn't like her credit misspelled cardboard sign?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when Peter Kaplowski saw this movie, he told me like it's like Ed Wood it's like Ed Wood's inherent vice. And I think you see that in these scenes where like the movie is, it follows this detective as he's going through this like LA tapestry. And I mean, you got to hand it to Ed Wood that he's willing to throw in sort of the odd range of tones that he does, incorporating a scene like that Sleazy Maisie Rumpeldink scene where like in the midst of all this like kind of cheerful squalor, he says, "Oh yeah, but there's also squalor," and you're going to linger in that for a little bit. Like that's a deliberate choice, and I think it's like kind of an amazing one.
Yeah, I mean, that was the choice that he makes that does remind me the most of Doris Wishman when we did our Doris Wishman episode, because her films obviously also use these kind of strange editing patterns and sometimes also did these weird cuts to just like plants in the room or, various things. But it was all about, turning the characters who would be the site of pornographic interest for the male audience who would show up to actually buy a ticket to a film like this, and overtly turning them into the protagonist in a story where they are treated cruelly, or they are victims, or actual sort of domestic disputes happen in some of her films. And that is definitely like the few moments that popped up, like it's overtly confrontational, like if you're trying to like wank off in one of the 1970s movie theaters, it's hopefully not to the scene of the detective, like belittling this like old heroin addict woman trying to make it do, like it's just kind of sad. Yeah.
And he has, I'm pretty sure the scene, oh no, he does. I was going to say the scene directly after that is the Alicia scene, but he does have a little sequence. I think that's actually where he says the hot tip line and then does the boob gag and then goes to Alicia. So he gives you a little bit of a break before the next kind of sad scene that he puts in there.
I would definitely agree with you, though, that the erotic elements are the most or the least interesting parts of the movie. I mean, I think you'll all agree that the kind of pool scene is kind of where the movie grinds to a crawl, right?
Yeah, it's a little long.
Yeah, because they do this. It's interesting that he's like, we have the initial pool scene, and you're like, okay, so there's the pool scene, and then he does another pool scene.
We're coming back to the pool table.
Yeah, and it's like consecutive, one after the other, and it's strange that it's like he couldn't come up with like another set or something like that. I'm not sure. Basically, the first one is a lesbian pool table scene, and then the second one is with the men involved. And so it's just like you get both, I guess. It was his idea. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it needed less of that, and it needed more of the moments where like Mac is poking his head through like that closet cart and like smiling and licking his lips, and he's looking at the lady in lingerie, and then she turns around and it's Ed Wood.
Yeah.
Oh, love that. Yeah,
great moment.
Yeah, I enjoyed that.
And I thought that he would be more into that too, considering how much he calls himself a chaser in the film. I think he says it like 3 or 4 times, and I was like,
There's an interesting passage in, I've read several of Ed Wood's novels, and I think Let Me Die in Drag, or it's all about this, this serial killer who's, on the, waiting for the electric chair, and he's delivering his full confession of being a transvestite serial killer. And there's this chapter, like chapter 2 or 3, very early on, where he's in drag in the bathroom of just a truck stop bathroom or something, and the old man Pops, who's running the place, is clearly so into him in drag, and it's this kind of erotic seduction scene that's just the narrator in the bathroom pretending to be a woman and kind of playing with this old gas station attendant's feelings. And you read that and then you see that scene and Take It Out in Trade, and it's Ed Wood really genuinely got off on the idea of being mistaken for a woman. And that's interesting. I don't know anything else to say except that that's fascinating, and it runs through his movies. And it
how many books did he write? Because it was I did a brief look at some of these titles. It's Black Lace Drag, the Parisian Passions, Drag Trade, Devil Girls, Death of a Transvestite, Nighttime Les, The Perverts, Raped in the Grass. I don't know about that one, Ed.
I mean,
Young, Black, and Gay, The Hell Chicks, The Gay Underworld. This was his whole 60s, right?
From the mid 60s to basically close to the end of his life when he was finally fired. He paid the bills as a writer for a company called Pendulum Publications, which dealt in, dirty books. And he was supposedly a, extremely fast, world champion class typist. And he would just bang out these books. Some of them you can kind of feel when you get to page 100, you can feel it's oh yeah, he's just typing until he gets to page 125. And so they're
he does have a little bit of a brute writing structure, I will say, because I did read Hollywood Rat Race in prep for our big episode, nice. which is a great book, and it's a half Hollywood how-to book for the aspiring actors and writers and directors who are thinking about making the move to LA, but it's also half biography, by accident, because he's telling you about his version of Tips and how he made it in, and he, to his section of Hollywood. And you definitely could feel in the writing.
Yeah, you would say that there are things so specific that you're he obviously lived through this.
Yeah, when he was giving tips on how to sneak into Griffith Park at night so you don't have to pay rent, I was okay, that's
he did that.
That's something you only know if you actually had to do that, which is also wonderful and gives you some detail and color about his life, which gets a little bit sadder when you get kind of to the end of it, which is, from what I understand, it's in this period. This is when he was a bit of a raging alcoholic at this point, right? And he was just going to die a couple of years later.
Yeah. By the way, there's another bit of advice in that book I like. He mentions that, it's actually not that bad to sleep on a bench in the park, just bring a blanket. And that's great. That's great advice for the aspiring Hollywood professional.
Yeah, well, one thing I wanted to ask you about, Will, and
awesome.
I was just curious because reading that book, there was one chapter that actually really did strike me in the context of this conversation, because it didn't apply so much to last week's episode, but there is this kind of incredible chapter where he is describing in pretty gruesome detail at times what various sleazy producers would do to young beauty queens from the Midwest who are trying to make their way, and they're going to get used for every dollar, and they're going to get their bodies used, and they're going to be sent back home broke. And he kind of had this element to him where he had an aversion, I'll say, to the nudie cutie exploitation market, and he kind of seemed in the book in 1965 anyway that he considered it quite gross and predatory, and that it was the only thing that intrigued him even slightly was the fetish aspect of it, which was that the producers would have the girls take their clothes off, but the only reason that excited him is because, well, there's a part in it where he literally says, and because the guys would then put on their clothes and then ask them to put their heels back on and step on them. And he was like, this isn't just like my fetish. Like every major Hollywood actor does this. And I can't name who they are in case they sue me, but you know.
Yeah. I mean, I would imagine too that like,
Awesome.
Like, you know, he was a guy who was living in kind of the, you know, lower middle class or lower of the Hollywood entertainment industry. So I'm sure like, you know, whether it was the nudie cutie genre or whatever, I'm sure he probably like saw a lot of that or like heard about a lot of it. You know, he would have rubbed shoulders with a lot of unethical producers. So, I mean, the apocalyptic vision that he paints in that chapter, you know, I don't doubt that it's true. I don't doubt that he saw that.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting to read that, and then 5 years later, we're talking about his return to film. Because how long had it been since he had made a film? Was it 1959 or 1960?
Yeah, 1960. He made The Sinister Urge, which, by the way, is well, I mean, it's an exploitation film. It's like, you know, it's there to titillate the audience, sort of, but it's about like two vice cops who are trying to crack a pornography ring, you know, and it's at least allegedly very anti-pornography. But of course, like the whole exploitation market that the low level exploitation market that he was working in the 1950s would migrate to sex films, basically. Like, you know, that's where, you know, if the people, even somebody like Samuel Arkoff, who ran American International Pictures, which was, you know, where Roger Corman made all of his films. Samuel Arkoff was quoted as saying, "Look, I didn't take Ed Wood seriously. He was a loser," you know, and that's how Ed Wood was regarded. So of course he ended up, you know, in pornography. That was kind of the only place for him.
Yeah, I just find that so interesting that he was very against it, and then it was like it became the only way for him to, you know, make money near the end out of almost desperation. It's a little sad, but he did also. I mean, it does, I think, come through in the film that he is less interested in the pornography than he is in the weirdo genre film he kind of gets to make around it, as we've said. But yeah, go ahead, Jamie.
It's just an interesting thing I picked up on, and it's I haven't seen enough from this era to know if this is just a common thing, but I found it interesting that he used almost like organ rock instrumentals for the sex scenes instead of what I always thought back in this day was more like funky bass lines and stuff like that. It kind of gives this like strange, almost over the top energy to some of the scenes where you have like sporadic rock drums and organ playing, and then some like slightly distorted guitar in the background, and they're like soloing out and everything. He kind of has a similar thing when we'll talk about it, but with Only House in Town, where he uses like big band jazz things instead of what you would think is a more, I don't know, sexual kind of music. And so I was
partial to all the xylophone,
a different energy
hits.
Yeah,
in totally. This one. I was like, where did they come from?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Will, with you diving into some of this stuff, like, have you seen any other like sexploitation or softcore comedies, whatever, horrors that have the same kind of music? Because I don't think I've ever seen these two things put together.
I mean,
in this way.
Probably not in quite the same way.
Weird.
Probably not quite as the same way that like Ed Wood does it. I mean,
it's got a different energy.
Yeah. Like, you know, it's funny. The only Take It Out in Trade obviously has its boring parts, but like I would still put it up against like he's maybe not as good as Russ Meyer, but like I'd put it up against like 80% of Nudie Cuties from the 60s, and I would say it's less boring than those, which, you know, have you know, an even dumber sense of humor, and like, you know, like however long the camera just grinds during the pool sequence in the middle of this movie. I mean, good God, like just you know, like, yeah, I do think this is one of the better ones.
I will say I almost forgot about this part, because I agree. I think that pool sequence goes on way too long, and it's pretty boring for the most part. But one thing I did like was when one of the guys and the girl are trying to have sex on the table, and the one guy is just still trying to play pool over top of them. There was something I got kind of a kick out of that. But yeah, that sequence definitely goes on a little too long.
Yeah, well, I do like after the pool scene, I kind of do like how he does wrap things up here, where, you know, Shirley does kind of get this idea. She starts hearing through the sort of really interestingly depicted like web of communication that all of these sex workers have with one another, where they all call and kind of like warn one another about people are looking for them. And I do like how this translates into like, you know, Ed Wood calling up Shirley and being like, that gumshoe private eye is coming for you. And you know, you better watch out. And it turns into like the scene where you have like what appears to be like a gender fluid or transgender couple, like dressed in like opposing sort of domestic gender role dynamics, like kind of in the kitchen, which then turns into like an extended scene of McGregor sleeping with one of Shirley's friends. But it is this sort of like comedic thing where he's like snoring and like talking in his sleep while she's like trying to wake him up with like her naked body, and he's getting distracted on his way to Shirley, and he's, you know, running into all of these various characters in this underworld, and it all results in this bit where McGregor actually does make his way to the brothel called Madame Penny's, where all of the girls, where frequently it's where all these sort of, you know, porno sequences have been happening, and where we've been kind of cutting back to frequently over the course of the film. And there is this element where like the girls have to kind of team up and stick together. And it's just like, you know, he's prying into my business. This is also your business. You know, this is trouble with the fuzz. The gumshoes are coming for us all. And it includes, you know, the bit where they like cartoonishly like lean in and like whisper the plan that they're gonna do. And, you know, when McGregor finally does make his way in, it's in this thing where, as Will kind of pointed out already, he's like tied up and undressed and kind of, you know, it starts off as like this goofy little, what appears like a pillow fight scuffle of some kind, and then like a bondage orgy, and then it turns into like them actually kind of tying him up and like torturing him a little bit and humiliating him in his underwear and taping his mouth. And I do like the bit when she pulls the tape off his mouth and his mustache hairs are like coming out and everything like that. Like the girls do, as Will was saying, like they really do dominate the really abusive, cartoonishly abusive detective who is trying to like hunt down these sex workers.
Yeah.
And he also, he fleshes this out by just having, you know, it goes on. These scenes go on for longer than they probably should, but it is because it's also supposed to be pornographic. But he still tries to kind of throw in some comedy in there. Like he does a lot of ADR in this sequence. And like one like line is when he's saying stuff like, one of the girls is like, now that's what I call titillating. Like all that kind of just corny porn jokes, I guess, and it's obviously ADR'd, and there is like actually a charm kind of built into it. But in the middle of this, because this right now it's just like the group of girls kind of doing the work for Shirley, and then Shirley eventually switches with one of them so that she can have like an actual moment with the detective. But before that, they have this funny exchange where they switch, and the one girl's like, or Shirley's like, I hope you didn't kill him. And she goes, what will we do with the body? And it's just a simple shrug, and they just move on to the next scene. And the timing of it is actually really funny, and it's a decent gag. And then it goes on to like them talking about the plan that we'll get with the conclusion. But I thought that was actually a decently well-written gag by Wood there. Mm-hmm.
But it does get resolved when the detective says, well, I'm not just hounding you because, you know, I don't like that you are a sexually liberated woman. I'm just here on behalf of your parents to make sure that, you know, you're all right. And everything just gets kind of, you know, very quickly. She's just like, oh, well, I mean, that's okay. And I do really like the line, and it does feel like a line that Ed would write, which is, you make your living your way, I make mine the only way like I know how to. And, you know, and it is very much you know, no shame to anyone. I'm a goofy womanizing detective, and you're, you know, an attractive woman just doing your thing. Although it does result in a hilarious gag where she's like patting him on the belly and then taking her back home to her parents, where she's just like, I'm gonna live the life that I want, and she just gets like naked in front of her parents, and the parents refuse to pay him because they were like, hey, we wanted you to like bring our daughter back and like fix her, you know, not just like let her be like a crazy sexual being. And he just like grabs the daughter and runs out the door. He's just like, because you're not going to pay me, I guess I'll take it out in trade.
Implying he's just gonna fuck their daughter for payment.
This is the ending that Paul Schrader's Hardcore should have had.
Yeah.
That's right. Didn't have the balls.
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's hilarious. Like, I also think that the running gag of him just using Mr. Riley's money for brothels the entire time is really funny. Like, the whole time he's under the understanding he doesn't have to pay for any of this. It's just, I don't know, for him to keep doing it. He's like, I'm going to go to Canada. I'm going to go to Greece. I'm going to go to France.
Yeah, the brief shot of Air Canada gave me a little bit
funny.
of a panic attack just seeing that. But yeah, and that I think is the end of Take It Out in Trade. So pivoting, I think, towards the reductive rating round. This one ended up getting like a bit of a solid 3 for me. Again, I think that this is it's a strange and satirical, like nudie cutie sexploitation movie with, again, the premise of the kind of silly, sort of noir elements that Ed Wood very much loved in his old Hollywood movies, and it's given many of his his personal style quirks. It's got the stilted sort of genre dialogue that characters say to one another. I do like the bit with when the private detective actually converses and makes the deal with the parents. It's like a conversation you've heard in like 100 movies of just like, shame, it's such a beautiful girl, and he's like, I require payment up front and the payment after the job is done, and and they're like, we are the height of elite society, we've got the money, but no police, no publicity. I was like, Ed Wood just clearly relishing being able to write a kind of scene he's seen in a movie before. But you've also got like the cheap, strange set decor, the psychedelic, like nonsense editing pattern of the whole thing. And yeah, I ended up enjoying this. And despite the fact that I figured with Ed Wood being a more sort of like openly fetishistic kind of dude, especially in his writing, that his softcore sequences might, get a little bit more of that in them. But yeah, despite that, he's very clearly having fun, like spicing up a softcore film with his, very unique obsessions. And there's very, very, many deliberate gags that are, well done, really satirizing this horrible, awful detective just spying on the girls and violently attacking like Ed himself in drag. And to include moments like that, it really just is like very clearly he's doing something interesting and intentional, and it's quite pointed and sad, and definitely did remind me what I like about specifically Doris Wishman, who made movies like him in this period for the sexploitation market for horny people to jack off to, but was clearly playful enough.
Too much pain involved as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real portrait of LA and the people he kind of knows in LA and the real places, as Will was saying. One of them is an actual place that he hung out in, and so it's like he wanted to include a little bit of realistic detail in there, and it's for the same purpose, where it's a punishing scene, that kind of makes you think about the kinds of movies that you're putting on when you watch something like this. And so, yeah, I think that there's definitely some value here.
Yeah. I'm also going to give it a 3. It's like a part of a new genre I feel like Will has introduced us to, which is like pornos that are hard to jerk off to. And,
my favorite genre.
Exactly. Keep bringing them. It's a lot of fun. I think that this is for me, honestly, mostly it's a comedy movie. I honestly was laughing throughout this unexpectedly. I think I might even like this oddly enough more than Plan 9. Just because I get more entertainment out of it. I think it is truly funnier, whether some of it is intentional and some of it isn't. But a lot of this, when I was watching it and laughing, I, for the most part, thought it was intentional on Ed Wood's part. So a lot of the gags kind of got me, even though some of them obviously are a little dated and juvenile. But I don't know. He's kind of charming in at times. So. Yeah, and all the sporadic editing, those jump cuts from like another one was that we didn't mention was when they were like, I wonder what Shirley's doing, and then they just cut to her like riding a saddle at a crazy speed. It's just like there's these things that he's putting it into the porno because it's supposed to be a porno, so you have to have naked people and all that, but it always ends up being more comedic than sexy, and I think that was endlessly entertaining for me. So. 3 out of 5.
Nice.
Thought it was fun.
For you, Will.
Yeah, I mean, when Ed Wood was making these movies, it's not like he was the worst director of all time yet. He wasn't. He had not yet become Tommy Wiseau or like put in that box. So, seeing this movie, it's just interesting to see a movie that I think like on its own terms kind of works, and I think it harnesses sort of a lot of what was interesting and unique about his personality. So, with the understanding that all of these movies are 5 stars for me, I'm gonna give this one a 4. just to kind of play by the rules and be reasonable.
Hell yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that'll wrap it up for Take It Out and Trade, and we are about to get fucking weird. We are going to be right back, and we are going to be talking about anyone who thought that this was a step too far for them.
An orgy.
We are going to, I don't even know how to structure the conversation around this one, so I'm very excited. We are going to talk about The Only House in Town, so you'll want to stick around.
I couldn't find a trailer, so we're going to do another Jackie Moon special. Will Sloan, Ed Wood. Accent on the wood, baby. The Sleazoids podcast. The only house in town. You know what it is. Keep it sleazy, baby. Keep it sleazy, keep it sleazy, keep it sleazy. Hit it, Josh.
All right, we are back, and we are talking The Only House in Town, the 1971 American softcore. It's deemed a horror porn, which I kind of guess that it is.
Maybe the first 5 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, this is a 50-minute unfinished 16mm porno film that was for a long time, because of the title, suggested as based on Ed Wood's book, The Only House in Town, that Will was saying, but and maybe Will can clarify, this apparently has nothing to do with that book, and that book was actually adapted into a film in the same year called Necromania, which is actually closer to the plot of the book. Is that true? Okay.
That is very correct, and it's baffling. And well,
it's confusing because they came out in the same year too. Like that made it much more like when I at one point I actually got Necromania thinking, oh, this must be the same movie because it came out the same year. It's based on the same book, but no, it's a different movie.
And actually, you mentioned unfinished. It does appear to be unfinished, this movie, but it was released. This movie played all over the country, often on the lower half of double bills, just in storefront porn theaters and that sort of thing. There are, if you check newspaper archives, there are ads for it, play dates from coast to coast. Oddly, Take It Out and Trade was not released. It was not picked up for any sort of distribution. This movie, The Only House in Town, was a production of the film unit of Pendulum Publications, the book company that Ed Wood wrote for, and they also paid for Necromania, which was the book, the movie that was actually an adaptation of the book The Only House in Town.
Interesting. Now, how does just briefly up front? How does explain Necromania to me? What is the book? Actually, I guess is the better. What is the book?
Well, I'll start with the movie. Actually, Necromania. Okay. Is closer to being a horror porn film, although really it is a porno with some sort of horror aesthetics. Necromania is the story of a couple who are experiencing a rough patch in their marriage, played by Rick Lutz and Renee Bond. They arrive at the sanitarium would be the wrong word. They arrive at this spooky house, which if you watch the movie, it's actually just like a house. But they arrive at the spooky house of Madame Heals, who is this mystical sexual healer. And she will solve the guy is, erectile dysfunction. And, as the movie goes along, it's a little bit under an hour long. The couple end up in various, sexual configurations that are not necessarily with each other. And it climaxes with a sort of like seance like happening with, Madame Heels is in her coffin. Look, what you need to know is the big sex scene at the end takes place in a coffin, which it was apparently a coffin that Ed borrowed from his good friend Criswell. And what you also need to know about that movie is it's got the girl's name is Shirley, as per usual. And it's got a lot of just kind of horror stuff in it, coffins and caskets and knickknacks and stuff, but all on a kind of I think the budget was $7,000 and most of that went to the film stock.
Wow.
So, and as threadbare as that movie is, it is still a world beyond what The Only House in Town is.
Yeah, well, because this was the thing that kind of blew me away, because I got to be honest, I was watching this and I kind of went, I'm not sure that I know what's happening, and I had to go back and find Ed Wood's own review of the movie to actually get an idea of what it was supposed to be about. And because listen, he describes it as The Only House in Town is about lust, rape, crime, hate, sex, love, money, death, blood, lesbian orgies, whores, bootleggers, and ghosts. It is also the story of a house and what that house does to people's minds. And reading that, I was like, yeah, sort. Yeah, I think a little bit.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Ed Wood wrote that review under a pseudonym in an issue of a magazine called Wild Screen Reviews, which I have to assume was a Pendulum publication. And I don't know if he wrote it before the movie was made or what, but the bootleg copies that you can get of The Only House in Town. And in fact, the Letterboxd description also has this statement that Wood's biographer Rudolph Gray made. He said, Wood evidently began as director, but was replaced by producer-cameraman Saul Resnick. In his resume, Wood takes screenplay credit. Ushi Dugard did not remember shooting this 1970 one-day wonder, although she has extensive dialogue. So I don't know what to make of that. I think, Hal Guthu, the other cinematographer, says that Ed Wood directed this movie. Certainly, what we see of the plot and what we can glean of the ambiance suggests. I don't know if Saul Resnick sort of took it over in post-production or whatever post-production was. It looks to me like Ed Wood shot a day of footage, and one of the money men said, "Good enough." Or, and just put it out,
they were like, a little bit of Ushi Dugard got naked. You saw her breasts a lot today. I feel like that, that's good enough.
Yeah.
That's right.
We can make something out of that.
That's a porno. Put it on the screen.
Well, and this is, correct me if I'm wrong here too, Will. This is one of the ones that was also alongside Take It Out and Trade. They were both, it was lost for the longest time, right? This didn't come out until the mid 2010s or something.
That's right. All of his later porno movies were lost for some variety of time. I think Necromania was found first. There's an article in, of all places, The New Yorker about the discovery of Necromania that you can look up. I think
who was on that beat?
Yeah, I know. It's amazing. The Young Marrieds was the other one he made. That was discovered in the 2000s. This movie, I don't know what the story of its discovery was, but I just know that for years and years, you'd read about this movie. For years and years, it seemed like this movie might not actually exist. It felt like, is this just an alternate version of Necromania? There was a trailer that I saw on a Something Weird video, porno trailer compilation, that had some footage from this movie. And then all of a sudden in the mid-2000s, this movie just unceremoniously started showing up on bootleg DVDRs and on the internet. So somebody had a copy, somebody put it out there, and now it's pretty easy to find. And the fact that there's sort of no fanfare about its rediscovery as kind of complements the fact that it's a movie that feels unfinished. It's a movie that feels when I watched it, feels haunted. It feels.
I agree
feels
a little. Well, I'll
way.
say I agree a little bit. I agree for probably the opening 20 minutes or so specifically, because I will say that, like, when I read what Ed Wood supposedly wrote about his own movie and what the movie was about, I kind of understood it in the opening stuff, because the opening scene of this, because we'll have to get into it, but like it is like 50 minutes, and the opening 20 minutes or so is like one kind of extended set piece, and then the remaining kind of like half hour, 35 minutes or so are a bunch of vignettes starring Ushi Dugard, the, you know, sort of sexploitation actress who I think was in a lot of like Russ Meyer films, and she was in some of the Ilsa films as well. I think we mentioned her once because I think she was in one of the sketches in Kentucky Fried Movie. But like right away in the opening of this is like the only thing I've ever seen of Ed Wood trying to do like a more of like a modern horror angle, because his vision of horror very much reminded me what I liked about the recent like Rob Zombie Monsters, that he has a very like ghouls and goblins and fog and cemeteries, very old school affection for like cheap, atmospheric Dracula era horror. And I very much liked that aspect every time he's tried to pastiche it in some of his early films. And in this one, you have something, and I think, Will, you might have mentioned this too, that it has more of that like modern, like Manson paranoia anxiety, where like a bunch of like a gang of like maybe hippie murderers like break into an apartment complex, and they literally just start chasing a screaming and crying woman around and like grabbing her in this like completely run down, paint chipped building, and then basically just start like an explicit gang rape that turns into an orgy. And this is like the opening like 20 minutes of the movie. And this is the stuff where I went, I don't know what this is, but it is very like off-putting.
Right. And by the way, folks,
there's a night.
And by the way, folks, I'm very sorry about that. That's how the movie opens. I mean, obviously, matters of sexual assault. You know, I mean, what I'll just say is like it's not as difficult to watch as it sounds.
Him starting out too with this kind of like creepy music. They kind of slowly get into the building before they start chasing her and everything, and they surround her. And it is strange to watch the scene go from the kind of, I guess, the gang rape to just an orgy, and it kind of just happens at one point, and it's a very strange feeling, because he goes from like that, he's kind of engaging in that, like you said, more modern horror. It's honestly kind of terrifying compared to what you've seen Ed Wood do before, and then he goes back into his more like fun-loving, just people smiling and laughing about having sex with each other, and
but still again, with like a really bizarre
instrumentation changes to like big jazz,
but still with like a really bizarre vibe to it, right? Because like for me, this opening orgy sequence, because talk about like sequences that you know are just not attractive in kind of any way. The way that he shoots this is, it's like, whether by limitations or whatever reasons, it basically just is like a mass of bodies just all conjoining and rubbing, and it honestly reminded me more of like the orgy from like Society, where I like just the handheld camera movement, totally. The like flat, ugly lighting to it that doesn't make anyone look particularly good, even though obviously there are some attractive people in the pile, the tinny like onset sound that you can barely hear except for occasionally like crew members like shouting at them, which is also not attractive and doesn't make it seem like a spontaneous sequence. It just makes it feel like there's a weird power dynamic that you're watching. And all of this, especially the kind of like weird ethereal soundtrack, it does make it, to Will's point, seem like you're watching like a lost snuff film or something. It's just it's a bizarre vibe that I haven't seen much from anyone, let alone Ed Wood. And so I don't know, there was something just really dark about this opening that I did kind of find interesting, even if I don't know how much of it was what was intended and what was like they shot some stuff and they just threw together what they could in a way.
I mean, the dreamlike quality of like Ed Wood's movies is something that I value a lot in them. And often that dreamlike, well, most of the time that dreamlike quality is accidental. And I think in this case, it's very accidental. But I think in this case, like, Yeah, like this movie the dreamlike quality is like very strong. So like it opens in media res, no explanation for what we're seeing, no explanation for who these people are, but also the imagery is so evocative of Manson, which just happened the year before. And it's like somebody is, and the rest of the movie has a sort of dream logic that it flows from this, nothing really ties together. Nothing makes sense. The story is not told in any sort of sensible way. The camera does things that have no real explanation. And like sort of in the way that, in your dreams, you don't really create the mise en scène in your dreams. Like the rooms can shift, the ground can shift from under you. Characters can turn into other characters.
Tones.
Yeah, like people from your life, or people, famous people can show up in strange guises. That's what this feels like to me. Like by accident, this is one of the most evocative depictions of a dreamscape.
Well, and all of the music going in and out, and the way that it ends with that girl just standing up and being like, I have something to confess. It was like, it was me who called the cops. And I was just sitting there going, what?
What?
Right.
Yeah.
And this is after 20 minutes of an orgy.
Yeah.
Like I looked at the time. It is 20 minutes from the
almost
start
exactly
of it to this end of this orgy. Anyway, there's multiple orgies, but this first one is like 20 minutes long, and then randomly she just gets up and speaks it. You're kind of like, okay, well, I guess they were after someone for some reason. So, and I think they mentioned something like that. They were the ones that tipped off the police or something. So
but what police?
You get this idea that maybe that's why they attacked her, but it's also, exactly. It's also up in the air and gray. It's so strange. And then it goes into Degard doing the hostess kind of thing where she just strips and says like, here's the next story that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, and this is what's interesting to me, because like the opening 20 minutes or so, I'd say I was kind of a little bit more on the vibe of the film, because I was like, this is bizarre, but I was intrigued. But it does have like a horror element to it that I think speaks to what Ed Wood kind of described the film as, where I was like, is this just going to be like a haunted apartment complex and all of the bizarre, like almost found footage, just disturbing, elements of it. And then all of a sudden it was united as a series of vignettes about Degard, who is in like a completely different movie than the movie we were just watching. And they are, strung together by, her, dressed scantily clad, slowly pulling her shirts off to reveal more of her breasts, and talking to the camera, and basically acting as like a bizarre version of like the Crypt Keeper in Tales from the Crypt, where she's like, sit down, relax, like take your clothes off, make yourself at home, and I'll tell you this really spicy tale that happened in this house a long, long time ago. And I could not help but be reminded, because this theater that Will and I regularly go to called the Kingsway, which is Toronto's grindhouse theater, 4 people show up for the 35mm prints that they play every week, and they've started playing this trailer every single time in front of it for this Robert Aldrich film called 4 for Texas from 1963. It's got Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin in it, but the actress is the trailer, and it's Ursula Andress. And the whole trailer, it's a 4-minute grueling trailer of her standing there, breasts out. She's looking at the camera, dressed in a cowgirl outfit, and just being like, Dean and Martin and the boys are getting sweaty, and they're, you should come and check this movie out because the girls are busting out the West. And she's talking in all of these innuendos, and it's very clearly meant to be like a sexy ploy for you to come and watch the film. And it's a very fun trailer. I enjoy it every single time I go to see it. This is the first thing I've ever seen outside of that trailer to remind me of that, of just like very clearly this like sexy sort of foreign woman, just like very woodenly saying sexy over the top things written by someone else, and like kind of confusingly saying it.
Yes.
And it being like the entry point to the male audience who is supposed to be presumably jerking off to this film.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the classic movies, like in Plan 9 from Outer Space, the fact that like so much is absent, it doesn't really look like a cemetery, it doesn't really look like a flying saucer, and as a result, you as the audience sort of have to project onto it what a flying saucer looks like, what a cemetery looks like. You as the audience have to do a lot of work. And in this movie, from what I can glean from Wood's writings, I mean, knowing him, I imagine that originally there was supposed to be narration here. There's a scene, or there are a couple of scenes in this movie where there's a painting in the background of the scene, and the camera will close in on the painting, and like the painting will suddenly be illuminated by a flashlight, and then the flashlight will turn off and the camera will drift back. Now, there's no explanation in the finished film for what that is. Clearly, it's like some sort of haunted presence in this house, but that's not explained by any of the characters. I think that's where some narration probably would have come in, or some additional scenes. And in the absence of that, like that absence in these Ed Wood movies sometimes, like that's where the dreamscape is. That's where you have to like, and in this movie with all this loaded imagery, it just feels like fucked up and wrong. It feels like there's like something evil about this movie. It feels like a bad dream.
And there's something always off about like character decisions, or just things that happen in general. Like, well, one is you were mentioning how the camera pans over to the picture. I think it's in the same sequence actually, where the camera also pans up to like this dark tree that's overlooming them outside, and it kind of gives some implication of like haunting or something looking over them, but there's no context to it. And then there's another part, and this is more comedic, I guess, but it just feels like strange because they don't really build up to it in any dialogue or character. And it's when they're having, I think, the second orgy, and a man and a woman and another man and a woman are having sex, and two of the women start fighting because they're both fucking each other's boyfriends. And I'm like, it was just a confusing moment because it's an orgy. I thought that was the whole point. So the actual like reason for them rolling around naked on the ground and fighting is just, it seemed out of nowhere. And in that sense, I kind of got.
I also like that the men have the shirts on and are just like dancing around without pants, and that's the only way that they're naked.
Yeah.
But the whole second orgy sequence threw me off because I think it's mostly all of the same actors, but just like the horror vibes aren't as strong. There's like Hawaiian like tiki bar music playing and
slide guitar.
Yeah, it's like slide guitar shit. I was like, what?
And
the
it
fuck
also
is
makes
going
less logical sense than the first vignette, the more Mancity vignette. It's like they all come in, they're doing orgy stuff, then they're fighting, then they're doing orgy stuff, and there's like Hawaiian tiki music. And like if this were your dreamscape, your subconscious would know what the painting meant, what the tree meant, why they're fighting. But because this is not your dreamscape, you're looking at someone else's dreamscape. At least that's my reading of this film.
Well, and then it ends with Degard just being like, "Wasn't that a wild party?" And I was like, "Yeah, I guess so."
Is that what I was watching?
Yeah.
It's and then they also do weird things like, because we're assuming that this is unfinished, and I think that there's a strong case for that. Is in the middle of these orgy sex scenes, they'll have the music that we've already said is kind of strange, like it goes from like big band to jazz to Hawaiian slide guitar and whatever else, but it'll stop in the middle of the sex scene, and they just keep going. So
and you'll just get awkward silence and like the moans every so often.
Yeah. It's the most bizarre thing, and it happens, I think, a few times in this, and every single time it makes you feel like you're watching excess footage that's not supposed to be there, but they just kept the orgy going. It's a very interesting and strange feeling.
Yeah, like the second orgy definitely was like a little bit less interesting to me than the first one, just in terms of like pure style vibes. The third one I thought was a little bit stronger because it had like a little bit of a more interesting character dynamic, which was Ushi Degard, her like tumultuous relationship with this client who she agrees to let in, but she can tell that he's kind of like a a bit of a rough character, the same way that maybe the detective was in the last film, and he basically does like assault her to like this like epic like fantasy music or something. I couldn't quite figure out what that music was, except for I guess that it was just meant to be tonally. This is meant to be a little bit darker.
And there is this one weird moment where, to be honest, it seems like the most intentional direction that's in it, oddly enough, where the assault is happening, and he does this zoom in on her face as her like hair is everywhere and everything, and it becomes almost like disorienting and kind of just all tangled.
Right.
And I don't know, it felt intentional, but with everything else, it's hard to say. But that seemed like one of the most intentional directions that I saw in the film, camera wise.
It's also strange though, this vignette coming, like this is the most, for want of a better term, plot heavy vignette of the film. Like the first two are just orgy scenes. Then there's this one where there are like actual sort of characters. But, as you say, the sound, it sounds like they put the microphone in a tin can on the other side of the room. And with, and with Ushi Degard, reading these lines as if phonetically, there's this strange, like distanced quality. And it looks like whatever relationship these two have, it again feels like you're just joining it in media res. And then the segment just kind of peters out with this. Like, it looks like they just kept the camera running and like the actors just started goofing off a little bit, which is, by the way, is definitely the case of the final segment of the film, which is nuts.
Yeah, like because you're talking about the switch where someone's just like, maybe you need a nice guy like Rick, not a guy who's gonna like assault you, and then it turns into a second sex scene where it's on the exact same set with a different guy, and it's like now she's it's the difference in sort of sex roughness. Now she's being like made love to, and there's like a country love ballad guitar twanging, and she's she's having sex a little bit wildly, but it's, it's a little bit more overtly pleasurable. And, that element ending where the actor who at one point is just doing a handstand, and he's doing it with his clothes on at first, and in this one
of the scene,
and then the scene ends with him doing the handstand again, but he's just full hog out wild, and it is just bushy and flopping. I've never seen an upside down man handstand with his cock just flying in the wind like that before. So I'll give credit to Ed Wood on that one.
That to me was. That to me was 100% like Ed Wood. Like it says, we were saying in the synopsis here that it was like they think eventually he was replaced by the producer cameraman. That moment just felt so Ed Wood. It was, they're laughing together too as they're doing it. It reminded me of like when the girls are hanging out in I always do this every single time. We just talked about it. Take it out and trade. It reminded me. Yeah, it reminded me of like when they're just hanging out and kind of dancing and having a good time. That felt very much like Ed Wood just kind of giving that comedic and fun energy into the scene a little bit and letting them let loose.
Yeah,
so that was
and once again, Ushi Degard.
And funny.
Wasn't that really something else? And I was like, yep. Very true, Ushi.
If that's what they cut out, what they left in must be pure gold.
And then I think the last story, the fourth story, is a brief foray into lesbian sex. And doing a move that, once again, I'm not totally sure that I've seen before, which is just Ushi Degard just rubbing her breasts along the woman's pubic hair. I was like, fair enough.
Now, if Ed Wood was indeed fired from this movie, like perhaps it happened halfway through this segment, because like the two of them, Ushi and this other woman, are just on this bed frolicking, and then towards the end they just like start sitting there blankly, and Ushi says like, do they want us to do something? Something like that. Like
I think I wrote it down. It's what else does he want us to do?
Yeah, and it's like, did the director just leave set at that point? It feels like a Warhol screen test. Just plant the camera in front of them and see what happens.
Like what a bizarre
moment. They even
end
the whole movie with her breaking the fourth wall within the scene. So it's not her doing like the hostess thing. So she's doing the hostess thing within the scene now. And she says something like, "You're still here, people? Get out." And it's kind of this like,
we want to have some fun.
That break the fourth wall gag, kind of corny. Yeah. And I don't know, that to me also felt like Ed Wood. So although you've definitely seen something like that before, but it seemed like his sense of humor.
I would definitely agree. It seems like his sense of humor. And like the whole the character names, like I think one of them is like Fleckless Flossie or something, like like and the whole setting of it's like, oh, it's at this like haunted bordello, feels in line with what we saw in Take It Out in Trade. And yeah, the playful fourth wall breaking stuff too. I forgot what I was going to say.
Yeah, that's all good. I mean, I'll just say like ultimately, if we are maybe pivoting towards reductive rating round on The Only House in Town, because that is it. It is only a 50-minute unfinished, largely plotless
orgy,
or like, not designed to be completely understood finished edit. I will say that, there was something.
This should have been called The Only Orgy in Town.
Yeah, I mean,
for sure.
To Will's credit.
Seems like it. It's just the same people fucking for 50 minutes, coming together in different ways.
I definitely knew that when I invited him on the podcast, I was like, he's going to make us watch 50 minutes of unfinished orgy footage by Ed Wood. And we're going to have to talk about the dreamlike poetry of it all. And I will say that there is especially the opening 20 minutes or so, there is a kind of ugliness and incompleteness and to it that does have like an intentional horror vibe to I think the way that it was kind of put together and the way that it was shot, because you could say like there is like some Manson imagery to it. There is like a more violent aspect to it. And the only issue for me with this, and which does I think drop it a little bit below,
only one issue.
Only one issue. That's all. Yeah. Other than the fact that I have no idea what's going on and I couldn't hear most of the movie. I would say that what I go into an Ed Wood movie kind of expecting is, the kind of the personality factor. And as we were mentioning, there are a couple moments where you kind of feel it. But this did remind me more of something like Jailbait, where his attempt at kind of like kind of a straightforward noir. And there is some detail in it about like the facial reconstruction surgery and some other stuff in it that is Ed Wood. But it just stylistically and tonally, it doesn't quite have the sort of like carnival freak affection or the do-it-yourself like old Hollywood pastiche, or as much of his like specific sexual diversity or specific interest in the kinds of people he hangs out with in LA. So this for me did not quite hit the level of liking yet. As Will said in the intro, maybe I just need to bang my head a little bit harder on the desk and give it another go and see what happens. But it's not completely without interest. So this does land in the 2-star territory for me, where I'm like, how I can't, it's hard to judge something on the traditional star rating system when what you're dealing with is something like this, I'll say.
Yeah, I'm pretty much right there with you. I think that the first I was really intrigued, honestly, the first 10 minutes with the like genuinely kind of creepy tone that he's giving this girl on the run in this weird, kind of rundown house, and when they find her, like the initial assault is very like, wow, like this is what we're watching in the first 5 minutes of this movie.
Yeah, picking her up and like taking her down that rickety staircase and everything. It's there's some power to it.
Yeah, it's wild, and again, he's kind of capturing a true horror tone, strangely enough, which you're not exactly used to, because usually he's balancing a lot of different tones at the same time. But as the orgy scene goes, it seems to just kind of inexplicably morph into more of that like fun-loving sex comedy stuff that, even though this is much stranger, obviously, that Ed Wood seems to normally do. And just in that first 20 minutes, it was strange to go from such a like almost harrowing scene to just a fun-loving orgy, and you don't know where that transition really is. It's really strange to watch, but there is some charm to like the instrumentals that he uses for the sex scenes. Like we were saying, there's like Hawaiian slide guitar and jazz and big band, and in the movie we previously talked about, rock, like organ rock and stuff. It's just there's things here that are still very Ed Wood. There was almost too much like incoherent orgy that I couldn't quite wrap my head around with his more Ed Woodisms that I've come to kind of enjoy and somewhat love. So yeah, it's in the 2 territory, but I mean, this thing is strange and wild.
And
I don't know.
And
if
Ushi Degard does have a weird energy to her, I will say.
It seems like she could honestly host like something that would be more horror-esque if she was given the chance. I haven't watched much of her. We only talked about her briefly in the Kentucky Fried movies, so I haven't seen.
Will, how is she in the Russ Meyer stuff? You've seen those, right?
Well, I think she's probably better served by the Russ Meyer movies. I think they play to her strengths a little more. Although you know what? I think this plays to some of her strengths as well.
Yeah, I think like there's like I like when she looks at the camera and does the line. It's just with everything else, it's kind of like at the end. I mean, with everything else though, it's just kind of it doesn't fit with like the rest of what I've seen. Whereas I think Trade is more. Strangely enough, even though there is a lot of sporadic editing and jump cuts and everything, I was able to kind of understand what was happening at least a little bit better. This has, like, you really don't have a story to latch onto here at all. So for the most part, you're just watching like a strange.
There's a house
orgies,
where fucked up
and then
sex
every once
shit
in a while
happens.
you get like a.
That's
Yeah,
all you need
and
to
then
know.
but then you'll get some charming Ed Woodisms, like a naked man doing a handstand. So there are still some things here to get entertainment out of, but it was just too much dry humping orgy for me.
Yeah.
So yeah.
For you, Will, walk us through how this is Ed Wood's last year at Marion Bad.
Five it,
Yeah,
baby.
last year at Marion Bad for sure. I mean, it's much harder to make the case for this as like a success on Ed Wood's terms than as, you know, Take It Out in Trade was. But I mean, I don't think I've seen a movie that is quite this evocative of what a dream feels like, at least for me. Not that I've dreamed this exact dream, but I've dreamed this kind of logic, this kind of atmosphere. And you know, there are a lot of, I think there were a lot of, if you showed me just a bunch of footage from an unfinished movie, sort of taped together with some random music and a title card, I think a lot of the times it would be, you know, just very boring. But there's so much in this movie that is suggestive and evocative, and it really does combine into a kind of disquieting experience like none I've quite felt. So yeah, you guys are just gonna have to let me do this. 5 stars.
Let's go.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
I love it.
That might be the biggest discrepancy in ratings we've ever had on the show, but
Yeah.
I love it.
I think it is in the history of the show, and I love it. Yeah, are you gonna, when you put it up on the Sleazoids podcast Letterboxd, Josh? Are you gonna have to go like 3.5 to make up for the 2 and the 5?
It's gonna have to hang out around there.
Sleazoids
You know,
approved.
bumped up,
Love it.
yeah, gonna have to do the math on that
That's
one.
killer.
But yeah, no, this was. I think that's going to wrap it up for our Ed Wood long lost but found pornography. Thanks so much, Will, for joining us and for bringing these films with you. This is usually the part of the show where we have you plug something if you've got anything going on. What's going on in Important Cinema Club and Michael and Us land?
Oh, you know, just the usual. I forget exactly what, but sorry. What a terrible self-promoter I am. Listen, folks, it's the Important Cinema Club. Me and my good buddy Justin DeClue, traversing all of film history from the high to the low. And Michael and Us is the Culture and Politics podcast. I host with my good buddy Luke Savage. And you know, pick one, pick both. Listen to as much or as little as you want.
Yeah, do it up. I can definitely recommend that. And also there is an old episode of the podcast where we talked about Albert Pune with both Will and Justin at 1.2 for anyone who hasn't maybe checked those out. Go back and do that. Will has been around for a while talking about and talking about the movies that he's been I mentioned I was Googling these titles and I found Will's articles. One of these articles was from 2016. So he's been on this beat for a while, and it was titled Preliminary Thoughts on the long-lost Ed Wood film, The Only House in Town. So if you want more of his thoughts, there are more thoughts about Ed Wood out there on the internet and over on his Letterboxd. But for our listeners, we are going to be back in 1 week's time, where we are once again doing a left turn. We spent 2 weeks in Ed Wood land, and we definitely felt the need to switch it up a little bit, and we are going to be doing some chain gang prison films. We're going to be doing one that I've got to see on a print here in Toronto just a year or two ago that I've been very excited to bring on the show at some point. We are going to be talking about I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang from 1932, directed by Mervyn LeRoy, starring Paul Muni, which is a really cool pre-code prison film that was actually made to like raise awareness of how horrible the sort of like labor conditions were in American prisons. So we're going to be talking about that film, and of course pairing it with a film a little bit, maybe people know a little bit more than that one, but in a similar sort of milieu. We're going to be talking about Cool Hand Luke from 1967, starring Paul Newman and George Kennedy. So that's what you can expect on the Patreon in 1 week's time. And then in 2 weeks' time, that is meant to set up a guest who had actually picked some prison films I'm excited to talk about as well, or at least some sort of post-prison films, maybe more about rehabilitation. We're going to be talking about one film called Straight Time, starring Dustin Hoffman, and written by Ed Bunker, with also a pass at the screenplay by one Michael Mann, and definitely kind of fits in his wheelhouse of, you know, sort of criminals on parole and maybe trying to find regular jobs, and it being, you know, sort of existential and kind of difficult. And we're going to be pairing that film with the Coen brothers' Raising Arizona, starring Nicolas Cage, which I am in desperate need of a revisit. I have not watched that since I was a teenager, so I don't even know that I could say what the plot of that one is anymore, but I remember really liking it when I was younger. That might have been like one of my first, like, Nick Cage, what a weird guy movies. But yeah, so that's what you can look forward to over the next two weeks here with us. So thanks so much, as always, for listening, and keep it sleazy.
Keep it sleazy, everybody. And by the way, if you were wondering why I wasn't answering anything in the outro, we were having some technical difficulties. There was a delay, all that. I think for the most part we cleaned it up, but thanks for listening, and hopefully it wasn't annoying. And if you don't think I'm excited for Nick Cage, then you don't know who I am. All right. Anyway, peace out, guys. Keep it sleazy.